I was born in Kansas City. I lived there for 18 years, and then I went into the Air Force, and I became a B-24 pilot. And I was stationed at Riverside at March Field, 60 miles from here. And I used to come down for parties, and I had an uncle and an aunt that lived here, and mainly for the first thing that interested me in film were girls, and I just thought, boy, what a neat business to be in. I stayed here in California, and there was a guy named George W. George. Well, we moved into the same house with him. I mean, he lived downstairs, and I lived upstairs. And George's uncle was a film director, and so he and I started writing movies. And the first one was a thing called Christmas Eve. It was made into a film with Ann Harding and George Brent and George Raft. I couldn't write the screenplay. I mean, I wrote treatment stories that people bought. Then I went into radio writing, which I liked a lot. But I could never get the screenplay. I could never get in. I never saw a studio. So I decided I'm going to go back to New York and I'm going to write plays. So I drove back to New York, and on the way I stopped in Kansas City, and I ran into a guy who said, "Oh, I'm working. I'm a film director." I said, "What do you mean you're a film? How can you be a film director in Kansas City?" He said, "Oh, I work for this Calvin company. We make industrial films." And he said, "You want a job there?" And I said, "Yeah." And I got hired as a film director. I made a little feature in Kansas City called The Delinquents for, I think, $63,000. Alfred Hitchcock saw that film, and some reason he liked it. I've seen it, and I don't like it too much. But and I went in and he interviewed with him, and he hired me, or Joan Harrison, to do that Hitchcock series, that half-hour Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and I did. So my first real professional thing was working for the Hitchcock people.
As a young child, I was dyslexic, and they did not know what dyslexia was in those days. Most dyslexia is an attention deficit disorder, and I could not concentrate on reading for more than a few minutes at a time. While I could not read, I could go to movies. And I was very lucky because my father loved movies, and he would come home from work, and instead of saying to me, as any normal father would have said, "Have you done your homework?" he would say, "Do you want to go to the movies?" And we went to the movies 3 or 4 times a week. I think my record for movies was 5 in one day. Consequently, my notions of narrative were formed by movies more than by books. I still did not have any notion of going into film, but I also wanted to try to live in New York and see if I could make a living as an illustrator or designer. I admired Esquire a great deal. The art director had just become a man named Henry Wolfe. Not long after that, his assistant left, and he called me and asked if I would want to come to work as his assistant. We met and we talked. In the early 60s, David Newman came to Esquire as an associate editor. David and I decided to try to write a movie. We were both by chance reading a book by a wonderful writer named John Toland about John Dillinger. And in that book, there was a footnote about Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. We did the script, and for 3+ years, the picture went to virtually every studio and any number of directors and was turned down by everyone. The phone rang one Saturday morning, and it was Warren. And Warren read it and said he wanted to do it. He then brought in Arthur Penn. And I think that collaboration between David and me and Arthur and Warren was one of the most fruitful collaborations I've ever been a party to. I can honestly say that I don't think there is a line between. I think the picture has all of our voices.
Well, I mean, I started making films too when I was young, just because I love films, and like most kids, you make Super 8 films and you know, making monster movies. And then I found in school, if there was a big assignment, like, you know, a book report or doing, you know, a big, you know, 20-page written assignment, I found that if I did a little film, I remember doing a little film like on Houdini, where I just, you know, shot it in black and white and, you know, time frame and did a little 3-minute film. I got an A, and I didn't have to write this 20-page report, and I don't even think I read the book. So I found it was quite an easy way to get good grades without doing much and having fun while doing it. So that kind of hooked me a little bit into it. But I actually always felt grateful that I never, in my mind, made that sort of decision or goal, like I'm going to be a filmmaker, because I somewhat lucked into it, which I think anytime that in life it's a surprise, it's just so much more pleasant, you know, it is like a pleasant surprise. And I always felt quite grateful that even though I knew I wanted to be creative and do things, it could, in my mind, manifest itself in different ways. It could be drawing, it could be film, it could be anything in a way, as long as it sort of satisfied that creative impulse. So when I got into animation and then got the opportunity to do actual films, it was magical, and therefore, again, I think much more magical than if I had said, I'm going to be a filmmaker. I went to CalArts for 3 years. By the end of the 3rd year, I got drafted to Disney, and that started that whole, you know, that whole track, which was great too, because I got to, again, although I was not good at drawing in the Disney style, and it was an odd period in the company's history, which I think, again, ultimately helped me sort of mutate into other things in the film business.
I've been fascinated by the imagination and the creativity of film from as early as I can remember as a child. I think that there's a point that happens. It's a transition point where you say, I'd like to try that. I remember at the time in high school I was also in the theater arts department and writing and producing plays and working with, you know, neophyte actors at that time. So there was a definite sense of wanting to tell stories, wanting to fulfill that, what I call the narrative drive, the drive to try to tell a story. That's the earliest thing I can remember. And then when I went to college, I actually studied physics. I thought, oh, you know, I'll be a scientist. I'll do something important. And I kind of turned away from filmmaking as something that probably I just thought, I can't get there from here. The films are made by other people, sort of these deities, you know, and I don't get to be one of them. So realistically, I'll do something else. And so I actually sort of clipped my own wings, you know, before the fact. It wasn't until years later that I thought, you know what, to hell with it. This is what I should be doing. Film is what I should be doing. So I threw out all those other grand schemes for what my life should be, somewhere around the age of, I think, 24. Just quit my job one day and said, okay, I'm going to be a filmmaker. I'm going to take a run at this. I did work as a truck driver during that period, and it was when I was driving a truck and writing that and thinking that perhaps I would be a fiction writer, a prose fiction writer. I would write dramatic fiction or maybe science fiction. That some friends came to me and said, we've got some money lined up to make a little film. Do you have any ideas? They sort of had put the cart before the horse and had fallen into a situation where they had some funding available from a tax shelter group, and they had no film. I said, oh baby, did you make the right phone call? You know, and I immediately sort of took over their project and, you know, quit my day job as a trucker, and the next day literally woke up that morning, you know, yawned and stretched and said, you know, now I'm a filmmaker.
My goal was to become an illustrator for Marvel Comics. I wanted to move to New York, where at that point, you know, all the superheroes in the comic book pages lived, and I wanted to go there, and I wanted to draw comics. But then I realized that I didn't want to sit alone in a room for 8 to 10 hours a day just drawing comics. I realized that I like to work with people, and I realized that visually I could create the same sort of, the same sort of world by doing film. I read some article, I think it was in Time or Newsweek, about film schools. Sort of sparked an interest in my head. I thought, this is actually a place you can go where you can actually learn how to become a filmmaker. And that was intriguing to me, because my parents at that point, and remember I'm in high school, they were saying, you got to go to college, you got to become either a doctor maybe or a lawyer. If you fail at that, you'll come back here and work in this factory. I was accepted to NYU, New York University Film School, my first and only choice, because it was close. It was close at that point to Ohio. It was if for some reason things weren't going to work out at NYU, I could always get back to Ohio and work in that factory. Our teachers would say to us, the best way to become a director is to become a writer first. So we had that sort of pounded into our head early on. And if I want to be a film director, I need to direct my first film by the time I'm 26 or 27, because Spielberg was that age when he directed Jaws. At least that's what he said he was. I don't know. So that was in my head. I have to direct by the time I'm 26. I've got to do it. I've got to do it. And as a result, of a screenwriting teacher I had, a guy named Jesse Kornbluth, who said to me, write. You have to write. I just started writing. I just basically started writing screenplays as much as I could. And through that summer, I wrote that screenplay. I wrote that screenplay, Jocks, which is based on my own experience playing high school football, which was a disastrous experience. It was terrible. And I wanted to get that down on paper. And it was sort of a romanticized version of the kind of people I knew. But I think the honesty about it, the reality of what I was writing about at the time, was what ended up not only getting me an agent. I got an agent because someone read that script, was probably the reason the script sold. It was never made into a movie, but at least I had made enough money at that point where I could take over the lion's share of my tuition at NYU, which is what happened.
I've had this one peculiarity to my upbringing that I probably should mention, is that just before my father died, my mother, I think during the time of their troubles in their marriage, they were invited to a church and became converted to fundamentalist Christianity, to a Baptist church, and they did not believe in movies, with the exception of Walt Disney films, which were consistently, kind of safe. But virtually no scene of films until I was a senior in college, when I snuck away finally and saw To Kill a Mockingbird. And that was kind of my end of the faith in the whole fundamentalist system, really, because I saw what a fine film it was. And here were these people telling me that this was the work of the devil, and I said, sorry. Cut to, many, many years later when I was teaching college. I bought a 16mm camera, a Revere silent turret model, with three lenses, and started making just kind of home movies around campus. And students who really were more, I think, aware of how films could be made than I was, came to me and said, we'd like to start a film club. And at the end of that year, my department chairman came to me and he said, it's time for you to get serious. You're not working on your PhD, you haven't published anything, and you're running around with this stupid camera, acting like an idiot. It's time you became a serious humanities professor. And I quit. I said, I think I'm going to go to New York and learn how to make movies. But didn't get a job. At the end of the summer, phoning my wife, no, I don't have a job. I went back up to Potsdam with my tail between my legs, and couldn't get back into the college, so I taught a year of high school. There was an ex-student of mine from college days, Steve Chapin, whose brother was Harry Chapin, at that time not the folk singer, but a film editor, and he was making industrials for IBM. And as Steve said, you should look my brother up. So I looked Harry up, and Harry was editing an industrial for IBM, and he said, listen, I can't hire you, but if you want to sit next to me here at the Steenbeck, which I didn't even know what it was, I'll teach you the basics. And at the end of that time, I got a job syncing up dailies on a reshoot for a film called Together, which had been done by Sean Cunningham and a filmmaker, a photographer, editor, writer named Roger Murphy. And they called me in to sync up their dailies on a reshoot on this film they were making. And at the end of that, when that film came out, the people who had financed it offered him the opportunity to make a scary movie. And Sean came to me and says, I know you're talking about wanting to be a director, why don't you go write something scary? So I went out to Long Island on a weekend with some friends and wrote Last House on the Left. And we thought it would go play up at their theaters and never be heard from again, and instead went on and played and played and played and played. So we sort of simultaneously were the new kids in town, very successful filmmakers, and complete social pariahs amongst all of our friends, because we made this vilely violent and unforgivably cynical, violent, horror film.
My mom was a great student of comedy, and still is. And she, in her classes about English or sociology, would always reference comedy, because she felt comedy was, joy was the most infallible sign of beauty in life. So she very methodically turned us all on, my dad, my sister included, to the great comedians. And from that came a real joy of words and a joy in art, really. And I fell in love with journalism and music. And so I became a rock journalist. I loved movies, but I never felt that was my destiny. Then I wrote the book of Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but I didn't think it would ever be a movie. And Fast Times started everything. And I met James L. Brooks, who, from Mary Tyler Moore onwards, has created some of my favorite characters ever. To meet him was a huge privilege. And I would have these conversations with Jim, and I'd pitch ideas for things I was thinking about, and he'd kind of listen. And then he'd say, how's your wife doing, man? How's your wife doing? And my wife's a musician. I'd say, well, I went out on the road, and there's this roadie that's in love with her, and the way he looks at me, and I know what he's thinking. Jim's like, that you should write. That's your life. That write that. And so Say Anything was the result of years of great kind of life-enriching conversations with Jim. And so this story just kind of built and built and built. And when it was finished, we had a list of directors that we wanted to go to. One of them had done a movie that I really loved. He read the script, didn't want to meet me, talked to me on the phone while a Lakers game was on. The next one was unavailable. The third one was Lawrence Kasdan. And Lawrence Kasdan loved the script. And he said, I would do this movie if I did a movie a year. But there's this other movie that I've been working on for a while. It's important to me, Accidental Tourist. But you remind me of the kickboxer in your script. You know this guy, and I think you should direct your script. Kasdan called the studio and said, I think Cameron Crowe should direct his script. Jim said the same thing. So they gave me the job to direct Say Anything. And I was scared to death. I didn't know about blocking. I didn't know much more than instincts, which oddly enough was a lot of what the movie was about, following your instincts. So I sort of learned as I went. Got a lot of help from Jim, watched his dailies of broadcast news, studied the way he directed, studied the films of Billy Wilder, and read anything I could get my hands on.
I'd always been interested in film from the earliest age of having first seen a movie in a movie theater. I felt that that's what I wanted to do. I didn't even, at that age, understand quite what it is that filmmakers do, but I knew that somehow I wanted to be involved in that, in telling stories. It was a wonderful, it was something that I responded to very strongly as a kid and wanted to be a part of it. I loved all kinds of films. Cheesy horror movies, Count Yorga, Vampire, scared the hell out of me when I was 12. Omega Man, I thought, at the age of 12, was the best movie I'd ever seen. My very first job in films was as a PA on a movie called Hell Night. It was with Linda Blair, and it was really the bottomest of the barrel in terms of low-budget horror movies. And that was the first gig. And the fun part of the story is that the guy who hired us, the fellow who was line producing that movie, was Chuck Russell. After I PA'd for him on a couple of movies, he realized that I had a very keen interest in writing. He was looking for a writing partner at that time. He was also in his sort of struggling to become a filmmaker days. And we started writing together, indeed, for a period of some years. And then finally he got his directing break on Nightmare on Elm Street 3. And our careers have just kind of gone since then into some fantastic places. I feel very lucky, very fortunate, and very blessed. But it goes back to, the phone call comes. Well, it's not Steven Spielberg calling, it's Steve Ringel calling. It's saying, well, you can be a PA if you drive to Redlands. All those opportunities are valuable. If I trace the path of my career, it goes right back to that. And being goofy enough to be willing to drive to Redlands and be a $150 a week production assistant. So it never turned down an opportunity because I don't believe any of them are wasted. And no job that you do in this business is wasted effort.
From the time that one starts thinking about what do I want to be when I grow up, I was really deeply passionately into the idea of being a veterinarian. I loved animals as much as I loved movies. And then when I finally, after high school, saved up enough money to go to a semester of college to kind of pursue a pre-med curriculum, I discovered within about 3 days of chemistry that I just had a complete zone out in that area. I couldn't make sense of any of it. And I realized at that point that my veterinary career was not to be. And I moved at that point, not thinking career-wise, but just sort of to keep my movie habit alive, which at college was difficult because I didn't have much money going. So I thought maybe if I could be the film critic for the campus paper, I could get into the movies for free. So I managed to somehow turn myself into the film critic for the campus paper. And when I left college after that semester and returned to kind of a professional life of being a kennel man and a veterinary assistant, I still wanted to go to the movies for free because that's a beautiful thing once you get into that mode. And I became the critic for a little shopping paper down in Miami, Florida, where I lived at that point. And my dad, who was in publicity, introduced me one day to Josephine Levine, who was the legendary movie producer, who was doing some kind of business with the hotel where my dad worked. And my dad said, my son's a critic, and Mr. Levine said, well, tell him to bring some of his reviews. And next thing I knew, I was a publicist in the movie business. And I just couldn't believe that I was actually working inside the movie business. And publicity jobs led to reporter jobs for some of the trade papers in New York, which finally led to a chance to be a unit publicist for Roger Corman. Roger was just starting New World Pictures at that point, and he invited me to write a script. He said, since you can write such good publicity releases, perhaps you could write a script. I need scripts. Why don't you write a motorcycle movie? So I teamed up with my friend Joe Viola, who was a terrific storyteller, and we wrote a motorcycle script, and then he invited us to make it, Joe as director, because he was a commercial director at the time, and me as a producer, and that's how I got into movies. I still can't believe it.
I started in live television, and the show I was on was shut down for a summer hiatus. I was an assistant director, floor manager. I was looking for a job. I was desperate for a job. And a dear friend of mine said they had a friend whose father, a young man of 34, was a producer and director of documentaries and commercials, industrial films, and he had had a heart attack at 34 in New York, and he was looking for an assistant. It turned out his name was George Blake, and he was nominated for an Academy Award for a documentary he wrote, directed, edited, and produced when he was all of like 24 years of age. And I realized this is what I wanted to get into and wanted to learn. And I stayed with George. And one day he gave me the opportunity to direct my first commercial, and that was with General Claire Chenault, and it was for Camel cigarettes. Eventually, Marty Ransahoff, who owned Filmways, a commercial company in New York at the time, asked me to come to California to direct commercials for him. So I figured it was a great opportunity to come out, pay my way, and maybe I'd get back into acting. I wanted to both act and direct. The other things I did there within the commercials was to do the show openings of the Lucy show, Lucy and Desi. And some of these commercials would have, and show openings would have, of course, Lucy and Desi and Bill Frawley and Vivian Vance. There was a producer who was doing TV shows, and he came over to me and he said, listen, if you can work with those four, do you think you can work with Steve McQueen? And I said, hey, we were actors together, we studied, we motorcycled together. Sure, I'd love to. He said, great, I'd like you to do the Wanted Dead or Alive show. And I was thrilled. My life had turned around. I mean, this is what the opportunity I was waiting for. I went out to the Four Star Studios, and I went on the stage, and Mr. Adamson took me over to meet Steve McQueen, and I'll say hello again. Hey, Steve, how are you? Great. Hey, Dick, what are you doing here? Well, I'm here. I'm going to direct your next show, Steve. And there was this kind of deathly silence. And he said, oh, great, great. And I walked away, and I said, yeah, it seems a little cold. He said, no, he's like that, don't worry. And I got home that night, and Ed Adamson called me. He said, look, I have a problem. He said, Steve doesn't want you directing. He said, you're an actor, and you direct commercials, and he doesn't think you're right for our show. I said, hey, thanks, you gave me the shot, and did somebody come? He said, no. He said, I'm the producer. He said, I'm going to work on Steve. He said, you're going to direct the show. So he did go to work on him, and Steve accepted me. And I stayed on with Steve for, I think I did 6 or 7 shows. But it started my career in television.
I started getting interested in directing back when I did Rawhide in the early to mid 60s, and was kind of almost on the road to it there. I directed a few trailers and a few things, and they were going to let me do an episode or so, and then CBS kind of reneged on the deal. They said somebody sent down an edict that no more actors who were on the series could direct, so they dropped me from that, and I forgot about it for a while. And then when I worked with Leone in Italy, I became interested in it because I didn't speak Italian. I was working with an Italian crew, but I was interested in Europeans, the way they worked and everything. So then I kind of got re-interested in it. And then Don Siegel and I worked very close together in the late 60s up through the early 70s. And Don was very encouraging. Don always kept saying, why don't you direct someday? Why don't you direct? And I said, well, I've kind of thought about that, but at that time, not too many people were doing it. Not a lot of actors were directing films, and just in that particular period of history, there was tons of precedent for it earlier on. And so Don encouraged me, and I had this little script that was written by a friend of mine called Play Misty for Me. This was 1970, and I've kind of one thing led to another. It was going to be a one-time deal, and then I thought, well, maybe I'd do a little bit later down the line, and maybe when I got to a certain age where I didn't want to act anymore, I'd have something else going for me. But one thing led to another, and I've just kind of been doing it off and on a lot of my own pictures.
I became a journalist. I moved to New York and became a journalist, and I was an amazingly happy person. Loved being a newspaper reporter, loved being a magazine writer, loved being a columnist, and kind of started screenwriting sort of half by accident and half because there came a certain point in the history of New York City where everyone was writing a screenplay, and I was one of them. And for quite a long time after I became a screenwriter, which is to say, after I began writing screenplays, I didn't think I was a screenwriter. I thought I was a journalist writing a screenplay. And then I thought I was a newly divorced woman writing screenplays because I needed the money, but eventually I would get back to this thing called real writing. And then one day I realized that I loved writing screenplays. That is, I loved being in the movie business. The first day I went to direct, I think I felt, looking back, I was 8 or 9 times more confident than I had any right to be, since looking back, I knew nothing. I really knew nothing. It's astonishing to me that I directed a movie knowing as little as I did. But it's okay. It's not a big deal. It's one day out of 46, and I got better as it went along, a little bit anyway.
As I was growing up in Chicago, I had no particular interest in film. I mean, I used to go to the movies. Like other kids, I'd go see movies, which largely consisted of Hopalong Cassidy westerns and Dick Tracy and The Phantom and serials. They'd run a whole bunch of things like that at a theater every Saturday. And for many years, through all my formative years, I'd say, I just was entertained by films. I never had any idea that I would ever be making them. When I was about 18 years old, 17 or 18, I was working in the mailroom of a television station. And one day, I went to see a film called Citizen Kane. And a day or so later, the idea formed in my mind that that's what I wanted to do. I've seen that film now maybe 200 times. It's the only education I ever had in filmmaking. I never went to a film school. I never had a lesson in either acting or the camera or any of the techniques. I just sort of picked it up by osmosis. And then I became a live television director before I was 18 years old. In live television, as I say, you would work a long schedule and you would work long hours and you would learn while you were doing it. Because at that time, the early 50s, there were no schools where you could learn technique. You learned on the job and you picked up other people's skills as you were going. So I did live television for about 8 years.
I went to college out here, Occidental College. After college, went off to New York and was the assistant editor on a magazine called Help, working with Harvey Kurtzman, who was one of my great idols as a kid. He was the guy that began Mad Comics. New York led to a couple things. I met John Cleese there, which ultimately led to Python. He appeared in one of the photo stories we did in the magazine. Having met John in New York and then turning up in London about 2 or 3 years later, and I approached him and asked him, how do I get into television? And he introduced me to a producer who was producing a television show called Do Not Adjust Your Set, which was a kids show. And it was written and performed by Mike Palin, Terry Jones, and Eric Idle. And one day they approached me saying, we've got this material, we don't know what to do. And I said, well, why don't I make an animated film of it? I'd never done one, but I knew how these things were done. And it went out on television. And literally overnight, I was an animator. And John had a standing offer from the BBC to do a program if he wanted. And so John was keen to work with Mike. And John was writing and performing with Graham Chapman. And so this brought us all together. We took up the offer at the BBC and became Monty Python's Flying Circus. And then my career finished again. And Terry Jones and I had always been frustrated film directors. We knew better, of course, than Ian. And we would sit there and try to tell him, well, the camera should be here doing this. And so when the offer came to do another Python film, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Terry and I took the opportunity to offer to anybody in the group named Terry the opportunity to direct the film. And since there were 2 of us, we got the job. And we actually learned on the job. We shot Holy Grail in 5 weeks. And we were up in the Highlands of Scotland. The very first day of the very first film that we ever directed, we did everything that you could possibly do wrong at that point. We panicked and shot close-ups. We're in the most gorgeous scenery and we're shooting close-ups, the kind of things that could be done in anybody's back garden. We shot close-ups and not the scenery, but we somehow survived and the film got done. It was a very fast and furious way of learning how to fake filmmaking.
We had this director on the Andy Griffith Show named Bob Sweeney, who was fantastic. Everybody loved Bob, and he had been an actor, and Andy was always talking about Bob, and the reason that Bob was so good was that he was an actor. So I was sort of beginning to make this connection between acting and directing, and I used to really spend a lot of time hanging around with the crew, looking through the camera, turning the wheels, operating the mic on the boom mic, and making it go in and out. And the crew would get a kick out of showing me what they did. And it didn't take me long to realize that the director was the person who got to sort of hang out and play with everybody. And that was the job. That was the gig. So I thought that was, that looked pretty good to me. And from an early age, I said I wanted to direct. There's an interview that I did right after I acted in this movie, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, where they said, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, I want to be an actor, writer, producer, director, cameraman. So I was fascinated by the whole thing at an early age.
When I was 13 years old, I went to see Lawrence of Arabia with my brother. I was already very taken with American movies at that time, the movies that we got in Wheeling, West Virginia, and particularly movies like The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape. Very early in that time. I shifted from writing short stories in theater, where I had started, to writing screenplays, because I already knew that I wanted to make movies. And in the late 60s, many screenwriters in Hollywood were getting to be directors. It seemed to be a very good route to do it. The sixth screenplay I ever wrote was called The Bodyguard. The script then was sent around town by this agent, and it was rejected 67 times. I had written 2 more scripts in the meantime. The second of those scripts was called Continental Divide. And unlike everything else I had written, this script immediately became very popular and in demand. There was a bidding war for it. And Steven Spielberg wound up as the person who bought Continental Divide. When I met Steven, he said, "I'm going to do a movie with George Lucas, an adventure film. We don't know all that much about it, but I'd like you to come meet George." And I've shown him this script, Continental Divide, and he's very interested in you writing this adventure film for us. He said, "I know what it's called. It's called Raiders of the Lost Ark." And I, of course, was thrilled. I had been out of the business 2 months earlier, you know, struggling for all those years. And suddenly I was working with 2 of the main people of my generation who had had enormous success. George had just made Star Wars, and Steven had just made Close Encounters. So we went off to a house in the valley and worked out Raiders, and I wrote it.
I got my Bachelor of Arts from Morehouse. I graduated in 1979, and I was a mass communications major. But Morehouse didn't have that major, so I took my major actually was across the street at Clark College, which is now Clark University, Clark Atlanta University. But their film department was kind of small and really only had, you know, facilities for Super 8. I knew I wanted to be a filmmaker at the end of my sophomore year. Upon graduation, I knew I did not have the necessary skills, so I had to learn them. And I applied to the top 3 film schools, USC, UCLA, and NYU. Unfortunately for me, to get into USC and UCLA, you had to get an astronomical score on the GRE. But luckily, to get at NYU, all you had to do was submit a creative portfolio. My thesis film was a film called Joe's Bed-Stuy Barbershop. We Cut Heads. It's about a barbershop that also fronts as a numbers joint, and I was fortunate enough to win one of the Student Academy Awards that year. The summer of 1984, I tried to do a film called Messenger. The money fell through, and it was a disaster. And then that winter, I wrote She's Gotta Have It, and we shot it for 12 days in July 1985. We had $10,000 to start with. We had a grant from the Jerome Foundation. Ironically, in trying to do Messenger, I got a grant from AFI for $25,000. And so when that fell apart, I thought I could transfer the money, the grant I had gotten from Messenger, that She's Gotta Have It. But AFI said, hell no. We gave you the money for Messenger, now She's Gotta Have It, so you can't have it. So I was mad at AFI for a long time. That was a long time ago, though.
The first real break as a writer is when I came out to Los Angeles, and there was a local show called Loman and Barkley, and it was a 90-minute weekend show. And it was kind of, there were only 4 of us, and we became performers on the show, and then there was Loman and Barkley who had come from radio. That was an incredible period of time because you come in on Monday morning, and what are we going to do? We have to come up with 90 minutes by Friday. And so you kind of scrambled and you played off the top of your head and you went with what you might just think was funny, and because there wasn't enough time. And that became really incredibly influential. From doing the Loman and Barkley show, I got a chance to do Tim Conway, who had a variety show on CBS. One of the producers' name is Ron Clark, and he took a liking to myself and Rudy DeLuca, who was my writing partner at that time. And we had kept in touch over those few years. I was doing Carol Burnett's show, and he called up and he said, look, I got a great idea for a film for Mel Brooks. and I'm going to have lunch with him, and if he likes the idea, I think you guys would be perfect to work on the film. We said, okay. So after he said, yeah, imagine he's going to meet with, you know, Mel Brooks, and just like that, it's going to be a movie, you know. And the irony is he called back after lunch and says, Mel loves the idea. He loves the idea. He wants to meet you guys, you know, and see if you guys are right to work on the film. And we met him the next day for lunch, and that quickly, suddenly we were going to, you know, write our first movie. In some ways, I'm like the last, maybe the last person to have worked on a silent movie, you know, because it truly was a silent movie, except for the one line that Marceau said in the film. And then I began to suddenly get really interested in the idea of directing a movie, just to see what it would be like if it goes directly from the images in your head and somehow through that process ends up on the screen looking like the way you originally thought about it.
A friend of mine, just by circumstances, a friend I grew up with, you know, my entire life, was going to go to USC to go to business school, and he talked me into going and taking the test with him up in Stockton, and to go to school. So I applied, and I, lo and behold, passed the test and got into school. And I said, well, what am I going to do there? And he said, well, there's a cinematography school there. You know, it's like photography. It's not quite art center, and it's not, you know, but it is something you're interested in. And I said, well, yeah, okay, I'll try that. And that was really my first experience at film at all. I didn't really know anything about it until I got to film school, and it was in my junior year in college. But I took an animation class my first semester there, and in the class they gave us 1 minute of film and said, here, use this to practice on the camera and learn how it goes up and down and how to make it work. And so I took that 1 minute of film and I made a 1 minute movie out of it. And I put a soundtrack to it, and it then ended up winning a lot of awards all over the world. And from that moment on, I realized I knew how to do this really well. I was sort of just, it came naturally to me. Eventually I won a scholarship, to sort of a work-study scholarship at Warner Brothers to observe production over there. At that point, I really had no interest in theatrical filmmaking at all. And I went off to do this Warner Brothers scholarship just on a lark, because I ended up winning it. And I said, well, I'll go and see what feature filmmaking is about, what this Hollywood thing is all about. I'll just go look. And I wasn't that interested. And they were making one film there, Finian's Rainbow, which was being directed by Francis Coppola. So I got stuck watching this movie being made, which I wasn't that interested in. And I think Francis, in a little ways, was kind of offended that I didn't have a lot of interest in what he was doing. And I said I wasn't really interested in this kind of filmmaking. But eventually he said, look, I'll give you a job to do here. You come around, be my assistant, come up with one good idea every day, go and sort of pick angles. And as it turned out, it worked out very well. I was very prone to the cinematic side of things. I was more into film editing and into photography. And Francis is very much into the writing and the working with actors. He's much of a stage person and very much into the writing aspects of it. So he kind of took me under his wing and taught me all the parts I didn't like, which was the writing of scripts and the working with actors. And I helped him and became an assistant in the cinematic side of things.
I was at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and for some reason, although my friend Jack and a guy named Richard and I had a house, and each of us had a floor. It was a 3-story house, so we each had a studio. But I also had a place to paint at the Academy. In a large room, it was, everybody got a little section and, you know, kind of blocked it off so they had privacy. And I was in my little section in this large room in the Academy. And I was working on a painting that was a garden at night. And so it was green and black, basically. And the green was coming out of the black. And I suddenly saw the green start to move a little, and I heard a wind. And I thought, this is beautiful, and I thought maybe the paintings, should move some. So I got the idea to do an animated film of a moving painting. And it wasn't at all, it was an experiment, really. Every year at the Academy, they had an experimental painting and sculpture contest, and I built this thing on a sculptured screen and an animated film loop that would repeat itself, and as an experiment. So it was an experiment, though, that opened the door to me, and that started everything rolling. 6 Men Getting Sick is the name of that first film.
I became interested in filmmaking, I would say, in my early 20s. I used to anxiously await the new Jean-Luc Godard or the new Truffaut. I really liked the French New Wave more than the English New Wave, I think, at that time, although there were good films being made by Tony Richardson and Lindsay Anderson, people like that. But I particularly liked Godard and Truffaut. Then I went into advertising because somebody said that if you don't really know quite what you want to do, go into advertising, because there's so many different aspects, so many different sides to that. So I went into advertising and eventually got on the television side, watching people like John Schlesinger, for example, make commercials. And I eventually got to make them myself. There was a lady there called Jenny Armstrong who was she was a secretary, actually, and she said, I'd like to form a company with you as a director. And I never directed anything, in fact. And actually one little thing, I'd done a kind of a title sequence. So it was really on faith, and I hadn't the slightest idea what I was doing for at least 3 years. I would sit in the rushes, when I'd finally got a commercial to do, shaking with terror. I mean, really, not knowing what was going to happen. And so it was very much a trial and error process. I would do these shot lists that very ambitious shot lists of what I wanted to shoot during the day, and then I would miss a shot, and I would think that the whole thing was screwed because of that. And I would go into the lavatory while the crew was waiting, and I'd be in tears in the lavatory, and then eventually come out and stagger through it. But it was a long while before I really knew what I was doing at all, if I do now.
The key to directing is don't take it too seriously. Now, I started in this whole field of directing never having any interest in it. I grew up in the Bronx, New York. I was a very sickly child. I was just trying to get out of bed. That was my ambition. Not success, not anything, just to get out of bed and to stop coughing and sneezing. While I lay in bed as a sickly child, and also a clumsy child, mind you, because I played a lot of sports and would always get hurt. I have stitches all over the place, carefully covered by the makeup of Hollywood. So I used to lay in bed a lot while the other children played, and I would think of stories just to amuse myself. And sometimes if I thought of a scary story, I would get scared. And if I thought of a depressing story, I would feel worse. So I started mostly thinking of amusing stories and looking at life kind of comically, and I guess I've done it ever since. My sister's name was Penny Marshall. At the time, her real name is Carol. It's a whole insight into her directing, if you know her real name was Carol, named after Carol Lombard. But this is my interview. Why talk about my sister's directing career? So I continued on being the sickly child I was, figuring the only thing I could do as a sickly child was to write. From playing drums in nightclubs and giving comedians jokes, I finally got a job on a TV show called The Tonight Show with Jack Parr, in which I wrote jokes for him. On that show, I met many comedians. One was Danny Thomas, one was Joey Bishop. Those two men eventually brought me to Hollywood to write for what was a new thing in the early 60s and late 50s, situation comedy. After I had written for everybody else, I created my own TV series. My first show was called Hey Landlord, was 99th in the ratings, so I was neither a good showrunner, a writer, or an executive producer. I was no good at any of the three. But my next shows became very successful, The Odd Couple being the first one. then to Happy Days, Laverne Shirley, Mocha Minji, Angie, Jody Loves Chachi, on and on. Many of them became big hits, and I was known as a producer, creator, writer, and that's when I first started directing, because I felt that this is where you could learn all the tools, and to learn it on your own show is a good idea. So when people ask me, how did you become a director, I basically became a producer and hired myself as a director, because nobody would hire me as a director. I never directed before. So that's how I broke in directing TV shows.
My mother was very funny. She was nuts, but she was funny. My father had no sense of humor. And so I came to California, and my brother, bless him, gave me got me into the union, he told me, have lunch with this guy, he knows unemployment, he knows acting classes, he knows this, and then he got me into Danny Thomas anthology. My brother gave me a life, basically. There was no bug around that hit me for directing, but because I was lucky enough to get on a hit show, which was Laverne and Shirley, my brother said everyone should try everything. You're here for the long haul. So some people wrote, I directed 2, Cindy directed 1, Michael McKean directed 1, anyone want to direct this week, it was cool. I then went to New York after Laverne and Shirley went off the air. I was dating this guy, we went around Europe on a motorcycle, you know, something I should have done when I was 19, but I was having children. When I came home from New York to get winter clothes, to go back to New York, because it was getting cold, I got a call from Larry Gordon and Joel Silver, who were at Fox. Would I take over this film, Jumping Jack Flash, starring Whoopi Goldberg? Now, I knew Whoopi was shooting it because I had dinner with her in New York. And I think they just saw us together and said, ooh, they get along, we'll ask Penny to do it. I swear to God. And I said, no, I don't know how to do this, you know. And I read it, and it was about a girl who was smart and good at a job, and someone on the computer typed in, I need your help. And that's what they were asking. We need your help. So that's what I identified with. Here were guys I knew who said, I need your help. That's the story was about. I need your help. And I'm putting my ass on the line because I'm going to do something I've never done before. And I did call my brother, and I called Jim Brooks. I said, what do I do? I've never done it. And my brother said, it's a strange thing. In this business, they pay you to learn. And Jim said, if it's not your movie, if someone else started it, if it's good, you'll be the Lone Ranger. If not, it's not your thing. My brother said, just stay on your feet and finish it. That's the most important thing, is to finish it. And that Monday we shot.
I decided to try to take the time between high school and when I was certain that I would be drafted into the military. I figured I had a window of 2 years. So I went off to New York to go to acting school, and that was the beginning. I continued to act on as my main goal, but I really was earning my living as a teacher. Then I was hired by John Frankenheimer to coach for him on a Playhouse 90, which a big show, and it was in the Turn of the Screw, the Henry James piece. That show worked very well, and John and I worked very well together. And then when John got a large feature film called Young Savages with Burt Lancaster and Shelley Winters and Telly Savalas, he hired me to come to California. It was my first trip to California, and coach 3 young adolescents who were playing juvenile delinquents in that picture. And by the time the film ended and I was ready to go back to New York and rejoin my family, Burt's secretary called and said, Mr. Lancaster wants to talk to you. And I went over to his offices at Columbia Pictures, which was over on Gower Street in those days. And Burt sat me down and said, listen, you should be a director. I had never thought about being a director. I didn't particularly want to be a director, to be honest with you. So he said, I'm going to call somebody. I'm going to have you go and talk to this guy. So he picked up a phone and he called Lew Wasserman, one of the most powerful men in the business. And I didn't know who Lew Wasserman was. So I went out to meet Mr. Wasserman, who said to me, what have you ever directed? I said, nothing. He said, okay, I'm going to give you $75 a week for 6 months. You move out here, and you can go to the studio, Universal Studios, and you can observe, and I'll put you under the wing of a producer out there who'll let you watch, and we'll see what happens. And then one series was canceled, but they had 4 or 5 shows left to make, but was going off the air, and they had nothing to lose. So they let me direct one. It was a half-hour Western. I just did a terrible job with it. I didn't know anything about the camera. I didn't know anything about the mechanics of film. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I made the show somehow, and they pasted it together, and the acting was very good in it. That was the part I was sort of comfortable with because of all the teaching. But I got very intrigued from directing that show, and I thought, well, wait a minute, this is kind of interesting. If I could really learn this, maybe this would be interesting. So somehow I got a second show, and the second show was better, and I was off and running.
I had always directed, even as, you know, I obviously became successful and famous as an actor in All in the Family, but before that I had always been interested in directing. Starting when I was very young, at the age of 19, I directed my own improvisational theater group that I also acted in, that Rick Dreyfuss was a part of, and my friend Larry Bishop, who I went to high school and college with. So I had already been directing, and I also directed some theater, some local theater in Los Angeles. I did a production of No Exit. I ran acting classes when I was 19, 20 years old. So this is something that I was always interested in before All in the Family. When I got All in the Family, I thought, well, this will just be a nice show to do. It's interesting. It'll never last because it's too hard-hitting. It'll go off after 13 weeks, and I'll go back to doing what I'm most interested in doing, which is writing and directing. Well, 8 years later, I'm still on the show, and I kind of pushed back the start of my directing career a little bit, but I don't regret it because it was a tremendous learning experience for me. Well, after I finished All in the Family, I made the decision that that's what I wanted to do, that I wanted to go in that direction. And it was difficult for me because at that time, nowadays, you see everybody making the transition from television to movies. I mean, everybody who's, you know, in television, who's made a name for themselves can make an easy transition to movies. In those days, when I was finishing All in the Family, if you were thought of as a television actor or a sitcom actor, you're a pariah as far as movies are concerned. I mean, you're looked down upon. That's the way it was in those days. So for me to make that transition was very difficult. People were throwing a lot of money at me to do a spin-off of the character I did on All in the Family with Sally Struthers, to do a spin-off with Mike and Gloria. And they were offering a tremendous amount of money. And at the time, I actually needed the money. I was going through a divorce, and I didn't have a lot of money. But I thought, if I do this, I'm never going to really go the direction I want to go, which is to become a film director. So I got involved with some of my friends who I'd worked with in the past, and we put together the idea for Spinal Tap. We made a short film, which was about 20 minutes long, kind of a demonstration film to show what the movie was going to be about, and I took that around, and it took me about 4 years from the time that we started creating the idea for Spinal Tap to get it into the movie theaters. It was quite a process for me, even with my name and all that. It was, you know, it was very, very difficult for me to get the project off the ground.
You know, for me to make movies, to be sitting here talking to you to make movies from where I come from, a few blocks down here, is like going to the moon. You see, so I came from a neighborhood that was Sicilians and Neapolitans and Calabrese and Abruzzi, and, you know, it was very, very cut off from the rest of America. Very cut off. And I must say this, and I've always said it a number of times, to give you an idea, I never went to the West Side. The first time I went to the West Side was to sign up to NYU. I just walked 10 blocks, 8 blocks down Howsam Street, east to west, because we didn't really leave the neighborhood that much. I mean, I left the neighborhood to go to my high school, but that was in the subway. You never saw what was in between. That was in the Bronx. At NYU, we not only were, the key man there at that time was Haig Manoogian, and he was the one who said, make films about what you know, as best you can. And he was very forceful about it, but he also insisted that if a student came up to him and said, I want to direct, I said, okay, where's your script? And if the student says, all I need is a good script, he said, no, go back and write one. The script has to come from you if you want to direct. But I was, you know, I was a very headstrong young person. I just wanted to do work at the time that was associated with film. So it was difficult for me to get jobs, and there was very little in film here in New York. But things were happening. Things were happening. So I started working as an editor, and one of the projects was an editor for Michael Wadley's Woodstock. But Wadley had also been a film student at NYU, and we knew each other. And he helped me photograph my second feature, Who's That Knocking at My Door? My first feature that I tried to make a feature, Who's That Knocking at My Door, with Harvey Keitel and Zena Bethune. And I become friendly with John Cassavetes through another gentleman who worked for me over the years and still works for me, Jay Cox, who was a Time magazine movie critic. And he introduced me to John Cassavetes, showed him Who's That Knocking, and Cassavetes was very, very supportive of it and told me to keep making pictures like that. And so I was working for John for a few weeks on Minnie and Moskowitz as a sound effects cutter. Basically, I was drawing a salary. I wasn't doing anything. He just wanted me, he was just so very sweet and said, okay, you have no place to work, just come over here. And I had a salary, and I just, you know, every now and then I'd record something for him and he'd put it in the film. I had no idea what was happening. His assistant one day got a call from one of the agents I had at William Morris saying that they have a feature film for me to do. And she thought it was a joke. She hung up on them. So it's the kind of thing that was going on. Finally, the agent got in touch with me and said, Roger Corman wants you to do this film. It's called Boxcar Bertha. I said, fine. And I did Boxcar Bertha, which was a major film for me because along with the film came Barbara Hershey and David Carradine. And it was a major film for me. I'd always prepared my films. I did drawings all the time. And I had, as I said, I'd been fired from so many projects that to actually get through the 24 days of shooting in Arkansas was a big event for me. I mean, it was all laid out on paper, and Roger Corman saw that, and he was very supportive. He says, oh, I see you're all prepared, fine.
Like everybody starting out during the school years, grammar school, and then wondering what on earth you're going to do, you know? With all that education, what am I going to do? I'm still lost. And I think the only thing I followed, which was taking my old man's advice, was, listen, you do art best, go into art. So I didn't know what going into art meant, other than probably becoming an art teacher. When I started deciding to go on cinema on my own, I tended eventually not to go with the guys, the buddies. I would go on my own, and I'd very often sit around twice, because in those days you could. But they would have A and B feature. So it was like a film fest, because you'd have two movies, and the B feature was usually, you know, very much a B movie, and the A film was the one you wanted to see, but I loved to see both. So, and from time to time, I'd sit right round twice. So I think the actual process of saying, that's what I want to do, started there, without me realizing or really acknowledging the fact that, how would I get there? How would I do it? Because these films seemed to just arrive in these theaters. I didn't quite know how they were made, but they were made. I didn't know who a director was. I didn't know really what a producer was, except sound very grand. And who was an art director? I can draw, so I figured the first connection would be somehow I'll get to be able to be an art director, but I don't know how. I got Hartlepool College of Art, and then I got to the big one, which was the Royal College, which really is a place to get to. And then basically continued the process there for 3 years. In so doing, found in the third year, my post-grad, I could do an additional course, so I took 2 courses in the final year. One was in my chosen course, which was graphic design, photography, all those kind of things. But there was a theatre design school, not film school. This was prior to the Royal College having a film school. And I went into theatre design with a view to, there seemed to be the avenue, was straight into TV. And I knew, because I was at Royal College, I'd automatically they would pay real attention to me when I applied at the BBC. And so I went straight in at the top and started literally designing shows, which of course would irritate a lot of people because I had to be told what to do half the time, but I think I was pretty quick on my feet, so I was ahead of the game almost immediately, which I think is why they gave me a director's course within about 2 years at the BBC. So I got a director's course within 2 years. And on the director's course, I did a potted edition. I chose something totally ambitious and totally ridiculous that you were capable of doing in one day. I chose a potted version of Paths of Glory. And, you know, the weird thing is, I always think the only risk, who said it, the only risk in life is not taking a risk, right? And of course it worked. And I got a show.
To be honest, I spent 8 years in art school, 5 years as a painter. And then I kept watching what Ridley was doing. And to be honest, I helped him before I went to art school when I was 14. I helped him make his first movie, which was a half-hour movie called Boy on a Bicycle. And I was the star in Boy on a Bicycle. And my dad was the grip. And Ridley was the camera and everything else, yeah. And that was really the beginning of my interest in film. Then I continued and I did my degree in fine art and painting. And then whilst I was painting, I persuaded the British Film Institute to give me £1,000 to make One of the Missing, which was a half-hour American Civil War piece, Ambrose Bierce's short story, which is inspired by a film called Incident at Owl Creek. And things sort of snowballed. Then based on that, I got into the Royal College Film School. So I went from painting after 5 years into 3 years at film school. And then I persuaded Albert Finney to give me £12,000 to make my diploma film at the film school. And that was an hour long. And each of those films contributed to me getting work in advertising when I came out of art school. I did, in my 10 years in commercials, I did one film for television, which is a Henry James story, hour-long Henry James story called Author of Beltraffia. And that was the thing that actually got me into Hollywood. Michael Eisner saw it, and then after 10 years in advertising, I said I want to try and go into long form. And Michael Eisner saw it and offered me Alive, about the film The Air Crash in the Andes and cannibalizing dead bodies. And I spent a year working on that, and it didn't happen for a number of reasons. And somehow I got the hunger after Alive fell apart. So I went from Alive, which is cannibalizing dead bodies, into a vampire movie with Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie and Susan Sarandon.
I used to be part of a Big Brother program for Princeton University, where students would kind of mentor a younger person in the neighborhood, students who didn't have family in Princeton. So I had a big brother through this Big Brother program. So he wasn't a real brother. He was just a guy who'd hang out with me, and he took me out one night till almost 1 in the morning, which was, I think I was about 11 years old at the time, and it was a thrill for me. And we did time exposures with his 35mm camera, and which is where you open the shutter on the still camera and you move a flashlight around and you can paint sort of lines with it on the film, and we got them developed, and I was really amazed by that. And then later, a friend of mine was a yearbook photographer, or at that time a junior high yearbook photographer. He was a little older than me, and I wanted to have a camera just like his, so I asked my parents to buy me a camera, and they bought me a Pentax K1000 stills camera, and I went out and started taking pictures. And by the age of 13, I had a dark room in my basement. I never developed them because I never trusted myself, but I always did the printing. I'd print the pictures. And eventually, I was 13 and I was visiting a friend named Neil Bornstein, who lived in Atlanta. He'd grown up in New Jersey, in central Jersey with me, and my parents sent me out alone on a plane to go visit him and his family, and I did, and I stayed with them, and they had an old wind-up Bell & Howell 8mm camera, not Super 8, but 8mm, where you'd flip the negative halfway through shooting, and then they'd split it down the middle, and then you'd have an 8mm home movie. And we made a film called The Star Trek Murders, and his mother knitted us Star Trek uniforms, and we used ketchup, real ketchup, for blood. And from that point on, I would borrow neighbors and friends' home movie cameras when I got back to New Jersey and just keep making war films and horror films and stop-motion animated films with clay and things like that. And eventually I graduated into Super 8mm, where you'd put the cartridge in the back of the camera. And I borrowed cameras until finally I could afford to buy my own. When it came time to enroll in schools, I was a very bad student in high school, so there was a college called the School of Visual Arts, which is primarily an art school, but they had a budding film program, and they accepted me in Manhattan, and I went there for 2 years. I studied cinema, but it was very vocational. We learned most about cameras and lighting, and which was good for us. I was very entrepreneurial from the very beginning, so I tended to sort of make my own river, so to speak?
Well, you know, I think the very earliest memory that I recall that associates itself to filmmaking was this urgent need to not be punished by my parents for wrecking my Lionel train set. I had these trains that I used to crash. Because I was a big train enthusiast, and I actually still am. I love, you know, like electric trains. And I used to run my trains around my tracks, and I would often like bump them into each other, and they would break sometimes. And my dad got frustrated one day, and he said to me, "If I have to take one of these trains one more time back to the Lionel shop to get repaired, I'm taking the entire train set away from you. That's the end." And I remember trying to figure out, well, how can I like have this thrill of the great train wreck and not be deprived of my train? So I borrowed his little 8mm movie camera, and I actually filmed the train wreck. And all the cuts, which I didn't really understand what I was doing, but it was sort of intuitively, I knew that if one train went left to right, and the second train and another cut went right to left, and they both met in the middle with the third cut, it's pretty much what I used to do when I used to stick my eye down within an inch above the tracks to get the perspective of the trains going by when I was playing with my train set. And I did that on film. It didn't wreck the trains too bad, but I was able to run the film over and over again, and I really believe that was the first time I realized the power of film, you know, to be able to get away with something and not get punished for it. So I had been making my films, my little 8mm, 16mm films ever since I was a kid, 12 years old. And, you know, I learned from everybody and everything. I watched a lot of movies, watched a lot of television, and read a lot of books on movie making. Tried to meet as many people as I possibly could. Came to Universal, you know, on this sort of unofficial moving onto the lot to try to learn all I could about filmmaking. So I kind of put myself through a practical film school, which was whatever I could get my hands on at the time. Sid Sheinberg was the individual who saw my short film Amblin and hired me, offered me a 7-year contract with MCA Universal, and then pretty much assigned me my first professional show, which was this trilogy of short stories written by Rod Serling.
Well, my life is very weird in the sense that it was a very privileged life, but paradoxically, it was also an unfree life, and I was very bondaged, and I felt very uncomfortable. I lived in a bit of a shell with a French mother, trips to France, no brothers or sisters to interfere, and very much a little sort of Fauntleroy life, and it was nice. And there were many great things about it, but you know, you can't be a comic book forever. It was a harsh upbringing in the sense that my parents divorced quickly, and it was a brutal telling to me, and it was tough. And I was in a boarding school, so it was all boys in those days, and boarding schools were really tough. I went to Yale, and it was a dry, poetry-less existence for me. There was nothing there. I didn't know what to do. So here I am, and I'm in a situation where I'm unhappy, and I feel like I'm not learning anything, and I want to see the world. I read Conrad's Lord Jim, which I'll never forget. It's just a book that had a strong effect on me in the Exotica, and I wanted to experience the Far East, and I went out there, got a job, I didn't take an official sabbatical, but it turned out to be one for about a year from Yale. And I came back to America and went back to Yale, tried to make it, but I couldn't, because I'd started writing this book, This Child's Night Dream. It was driving me crazy. I had to finish this book. It was the most important thing in life. Started in Mexico, finished the book, dropped out of Yale a second time. They fired me for good this time because I was flunking everything. And I went and joined the military because the solution to me was to be more honest with myself even and say there was something wrong that I still haven't solved in the book, you see. So I wanted to go to the bottom of the barrel, and that's where I went. I insisted. I really was worried the war was to be over by the time I got there. So I said, you know, I want to go right through basic and advanced, and I want to go to Vietnam in a frontline company. And they said, sure. And, you know, they checked it off. And they sent me there. They didn't lie to me and sent me to Germany at least, but, like in a Joseph Heller novel or something. But anyway, so I came back from Vietnam really much more visual. Because one thing you do in Vietnam is you pay attention. You take very strict attention. You don't sleep that much. You watch, you see, you hear, you smell, you touch. So I got to that place where I was using all my senses. That's when I got my camera towards the end, and I started to shoot pictures because I really thought the landscape was great. The pictures brought out a side of me that I decided like I wanted to go back to writing, but writing in conjunction with picture. And that's what brought me to movies. And I was very lucky, really timely in the sense that at that time, in '69, early '69, when I returned, they were starting film schools all over. You know, not all over, but a few places like NYU and they were getting known, and it was okay all of a sudden. It was socially acceptable to go to one of these places. I would never go to a trade school. It wouldn't have been in my nature. I was brought up to go to Yale, you know. So a trade school would have been my father's nightmare. But I did end up, in a sense, going to the trade school at NYU on the GI Bill, which paid for quite a bit of it, $1,800 a month, I think. That was a good bill. And studied film for 2.5 years and learned a lot, and then became a taxi driver. And that becomes another saga.
I would say I was fascinated by the illusion of movies before anything else. Always trying to figure out how they did something, how they did a visual effect, or how they did an action sequence, and became obsessed with how they sync sound up with the picture, and tried to figure out a way to do that with home movies. And so I guess my passion for film came from the technical end first. I was at USC, and that was the what they call the 480 project, and that's where you direct for a semester. You have to put a crew together of 5 people, and you make a film. And it was supposed to be, it was color, sync sound, 16 millimeter. It's supposed to be about somewhere between 3 minutes and 20 minutes. And I came up with this idea for Field of Honor, and and at the time it was it created quite a stir at the university, because it had some action. It had action in it, and that was pretty interesting. We met Stephen. Well, I had met Stephen when I was at USC, but we formally met Stephen when we pitched to John Milius this idea to write the screenplay called 1941. When John read that screenplay, he gave it to Stephen, and Stephen loved it and said, I want to make this as my next movie, but I'm about to start this movie in Alabama called Close Encounters. He directed the movie during the day, and we rewrote 1941 in the evenings. And at that time, we came up with this idea for what turned out to be I Want to Hold Your Hand, and we pitched Stephen the idea, and he didn't get it at the time. So Bob and I kept thinking about it. We came back to Hollywood, and we set the project up at Warner Brothers. We wrote the screenplay. And at that time, Warner Brothers had a policy of not making movies with first-time directors. So but that had nothing. I mean, I gave Stephen the screenplay for him to critique it and give us some notes when we wrote the screenplay. And so when he read the screenplay, he said, you know, Bob, you should direct this. And I said, boy, that would be great. How do we do that? He said, well, let me make some phone calls. And he got Sid Sheinberg on the phone and said, there's this young guy, I think he's great. He made this student film, and he wrote this screenplay. It's a little movie, won't cost a lot of money. And I believe that what he said to Sid was, and it may not have, I mean, this is my assumption, was, you know, if he cracks up, or you know, if he doesn't finish the movie, I'll be there to finish it. So, you know, at worst, you'll end up with a movie that I half direct. Luckily, that wasn't the case, but I think that kind of made, you know, Sid feel, you know, secure. So between the two of them, that's how I got my directing break.
I guess the unique sense of humor was probably more from my dad, and the skepticism about what was coming across on the TV channels or in the movies came from my mom. I mean, we would, I remember sitting in our den watching TV with the family, and it was my mom who would talk back to the TV and criticize what was going on, and that's kind of where the satire comes from. My dad has a very dry sense of humor and sarcastic, and we just, and would always put people on. I mean, that was his natural bent. While we were in college, Jerry and I made some Super 8mm student movies. I mean, and one was a very funny 10-minute movie about Jerry running around the campus trying to find a place to take a leak.
We ran our small theater called Kentucky Fried Theater in Los Angeles from, well, first on the campus of Madison for a year in 1971. Then we loaded up a U-Haul truck, and Jerry and Jim and I, you know, drove out west in 1972, set up the whole theater just as we had in Madison. It was about 70 seats, and we had twice that many in California. And we set that up in 1972 and ran that until 75 when we started writing, well, actually even before that we started writing scripts. And the first script we did was to Airplane, but we couldn't sell it, of course. So we had gotten to know John Landis meanwhile, and he suggested, why don't you do a movie of your show, like Ken Shapiro had done with GrooveTube. So we wrote that script, and that we managed to get financed because we put our own money into 10 minutes of film that went right into what was going to be Kentucky Fried Movie. And that proved to United Artists Theater Circuit, who financed it, that we could do it. So, and we got Bob Weiss to produce, and John Landis directed, and we were the writers and producers at the same time. And the first time we had ever been on a movie set. And we kind of learned how it was done, and also at the same time we learned that to really want a movie to come out the way we wanted to, we had to direct. And so that's the next movie, Airplane, we insisted on directing it.